And welcome back. Just kidding, I'm not going to do the podcast intro. This is not my show. But for those of you who don't know me, my name is Nick Sistari. I'm the host of the Core Knowledge Podcast, a podcast that's solely devoted to bringing awareness to the heat beneath our feet, which is what we're doing here today. So I'm excited to be joined by Jocelyn Lyon, Zach Barov, and we're excited to jump into heating and cooling, which Jamie mentioned at the very beginning of today, that largely it's forgotten about. Most times people talk about geothermal. Well, first they forget that geothermal exists anywhere beyond volcanoes or hot springs, but then they also forget that power is not the only thing that we can do with geothermal, and largely it's actually a lot harder to get power sometimes than it is to do heating and cooling. Shh. Okay, perfect. So we're going to talk about why that might be. What are some of the hurdles and challenges we see? Heating and cooling is going to be one of the hardest things to decarbonize in the globe. It accounts for not only one of the largest amounts of energy demand, but then on the flip side, the largest percentage of emissions. So it's a big topic that needs to be solved. We talked about data centers. That's one area, but there's also residential and commercial. And so excited to jump into those topics today. So as I mentioned, I have Jocelyn Lyon, that's a co-founder and CEO of Bedrock Energy, and then Zach Turov, who is with EcoSmart Solutions. And so we'll talk some more about the project they're working on right here. And so let's kick it off first. Jocelyn, talk about Bedrock and what was the Kickstarter, what got you into starting Bedrock, and what's the ultimate problem you're trying to solve with Bedrock?
Sure. Thanks so much, Nick. So as Nick mentioned, geothermal, and also Dr. Ken Wizian in the last panel also mentioned, directly using the earth for heating and cooling is one of the longest established ways of using geothermal. In fact, I would say 30 years ago, there was more geothermal for heating and cooling of buildings than there was solar. What has happened since then? Solar is like $1 trillion asset class, and geothermal is still about 1% of real estate. And so at Bedrock, what we saw when we looked at this disparity is that the potential for geothermal to heat and cool buildings, provide resiliency no matter the crazy weather that you're starting to get across most of the world, and help to provide that kind of like free thermal energy into buildings anywhere in the world. There is so much potential there, but it just hasn't really scaled because energy just has to be cheaper and more accessible in order to be adopted. And the big challenge with geothermal for heating and cooling is that you are drilling in urban and suburban areas to capture that thermal energy right in somebody's courtyard or parking lot, or sometimes even under their building. And to really scale that, you have to get really, really good, fast, clean, quiet, and just overall confident and streamlined in drilling and installing geothermal heat exchange systems in incredibly developed, busy, populated areas. So coming back to Nick's question of what is Bedrock and why do we looked at this enormous opportunity for billions of boreholes in urban areas to get clean thermal energy for buildings. And then we looked at the fact that the drilling over the past 50, 60 years has just not been the most sophisticated for geothermal heating and cooling in buildings. And so we said, all right, let's go bring robotics and automation for drilling, which the oil and gas industry knows a lot about, but resize it so that you're talking about nimble, small machines that can drill really quickly, affordably, and seamlessly in developed areas. So that's what we do at Bedrock. We bring the technology stack to getting the ground much more accessible as a infinite clean energy resource for real estate, even in places as busy as downtown Austin, which we'll talk about probably later if Nick gives me the opportunity.
Absolutely. And we'll get to Zach, which is going into this, talk about your own backyard. Well, let's literally jump into this idea of a sort of a district heating, but also just a neighborhood setting, and talk about EcoSmart's Whisper Valley project, and kind of just give us an overview of what that project entails.
Yeah, so Whisper Valley is a 7,500 unit master plan community in East Austin, 7,500 units at full build out. We are about probably 4 phases into that. So there's about 800 homes constructed and being heated and cooled by a district geothermal system. And so, it's a more affordable community, it's a more efficient community, and it's a more reliable community. Those are the 3 key pillars of kind of what we're accomplishing out there. And what EcoSmart does within the community is design the system, work with all of the different parties, the developer, the builder, the utility, the municipality, in really making sure this system meets everybody's needs. They understand it, they understand the benefit. We provide construction oversight for the system itself, and then eventually we are essentially an energy service provider within Whisper Valley, maintaining that system, just making sure that it's operating as good as it should and it's improving in performance over time. And so, it's a really unique community because we've delivered this system at scale. We're building housing at scale that's extremely efficient. These are production homes with some of the largest builders in the nation, Richmond American, David Weekley, and they're able to take their standard product and make it extremely efficient just by changing out the HVAC system and applying solar to it as well. So, we have plans of growing the community. It's single-family for sale product so far, but to also include multifamily and commercial space. There's 3 schools in the community as well that are using geothermal. So the idea is to take this technology that's really not new. It's been used a whole lot, but introduce it to a platform of people that think it's new, make sure it goes very well, and really build housing at scale and build a community at scale that's more efficient, reliable, and resilient at the end of the day.
Yeah, awesome. And I want to touch on that idea of the more efficient and just
Sure.
sort of it's not new, but
Yeah.
largely in Texas and other areas, we have not really seen ground
Yeah.
source heat pumps or district heating networks, where on the East Coast and other areas, it's very prevalent. Boise, Idaho, the whole
Yep.
town is
Yep.
on these systems. And so what do you think the main reasons that we haven't seen it? And then touch on that efficiency point of why is it so efficient to use that versus the traditional HVAC?
Yeah, so it's more efficient because we're using the earth to heat and cool a home compared to outdoor air, and the earth could be 70 degrees year-round at a certain depth compared to 20 degrees outside or 100 degrees outside outdoor air that you're trying to heat and cool your home with to reach 60 degrees. So it's just inherently far more efficient to do that. I think it's kind of interesting. I think geothermal can be very market-driven. In certain aspects, you need to... at least with a certain subset of people, real estate developers care eventually about how does this affect my real estate deal and does it work from a pro forma standpoint. And so you have to really create creative solutions to make it work for their deal and really coach them on it and help them understand all of the benefits outside of just the pro forma analysis. This is a more resilient community. It's a better living environment for the tenant or the resident. And I just don't think there's been an entity like that, like EcoSmart and even like Bedrock, that's come into the marketplace and really work with developers to try to create it into a solution that makes sense to developers, so that really adoption is driven.
Bringing awareness is what we're trying to do here, obviously on different topics and things. And so I always talk about on the podcast of boiling it down to starting at the base level of just the average person who's walking in off the street all the way to obviously someone who knows about industry. So is this... does EcoSmart working obviously with the developers, but is this something, it's clearly broadcast as the community, but is there ownership of like telling these homeowners, what exactly is being done here to sort of give them frame to then tell others and spread kind of this, hey, my home does X, Y, and Z and the fraction of a cost of what your typical system does?
Yeah, it's within the ethos of the community. Everything about Whisper is really focused on the sustainability of the community, and so home buyers coming in when they deal with a sales agent in a model home are kind of informed on the systems that are within their home. We send out kind of like an owner's manual almost in a way of the technology and everything when they're closing on the home so they can get an idea of what's in it and kind of best practices to using it. And it's marketed like crazy. The aspect of sustainability, efficiency, more affordable utility bills, all those things I think is really well broadcasted to all of the different homeowners. And within the community itself, it's kind of like a gamification of, I spent this much this month on my utility bill. What did you spend? Okay, I have Sense in my house, so I can kind of see what's using electricity and try to get better. And it's kind of like becomes this competitive thing that we've seen in the community, which is really cool because people are informed. They know these technologies are in their home, and they really see the benefit of doing it, and they continue to improve over time by dealing with those in the community.
Yeah, and is this something, and then I'll get to Jocelyn on that, do you think, this is just purely a question on my end, in terms of current infrastructure that we have that has obviously a bunch of natural gas pipelines, we have a lot of infrastructure in the ground, is this something that EcoSmart or just in general the industry we could convert these systems to become district heating networks? Is that a potential avenue for even communities that exist today without building a totally new system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something being studied. You may know this better than me, but no, I mean, I think it's being studied. It's costly, so there's a lot of analysis that has to go into if this makes sense. And doing retrofits with geothermal, you have to get buy-in of different stakeholders, retrofit buildings possibly as well to accommodate these systems. So I think it is being studied though, and there is benefits, of course, to doing that from an efficiency standpoint.
Yeah, and then Jocelyn, you mentioned the technology and obviously oil and gas transfer, and do you think this was historically sort of an issue of there wasn't communication between industries? Obviously the scale and the size was different, but the ultimate idea of what we're doing was there. So why do you think it maybe took a while in terms of the traction of just saying, hey, why can't we just take what is there, downsize it, tailor it, and use it in, this form?
Yeah, I think you need certain industry inflection points in order for that technology transfer to happen, right? That technology transfer could have happened 15, 20 years ago, but there wasn't a moment where geothermal really had this huge value proposition to the real estate industry, to utilities. And so you have to have those pushes, right? And I think what we're seeing right now in the United States is there is all of these factors that are landing at the same time, right? First, you have the fact that the grid is unbelievably constrained, right? If you want to build a new community or a new data center or a new warehouse and kind of commercial center in some of these high growth areas, the utilities are telling you, okay, you can have that power in 2031. Or you can you can occupy and operate your building if you produce your 10 megawatts of power by yourself. And so that's obviously not sustainable. And so you're starting to see industry say, shoot, how do I produce and store power myself? And then how do I reduce my peaky power needs when, half of my power demand is actually for heating and cooling, and half of that is actually just serving the summer peaks and the winter peaks. Oh, geothermal could cut off that entire peak demand, and then that can help me operate my building or occupy my building so much earlier. So you have that drive from an energy ecosystem standpoint. I think you also have a push from states and sometimes cities in terms of decarbonization. This does happen to be the kinds of cities you would imagine, so Austin and Chicago and New York and Boston, but that's enough for real estate developers to start saying, okay, I need to have a strategy around a net zero building or a net zero ready building. So that's a really big push. And then even if it's not from the regulatory level, I think businesses, tenants, homeowners are starting to think about how do I buy a more resilient home. So you kind of see these factors that are different now than they were 15, 20 years ago. And that creates a market and creates the ability for people to say, okay, the time is ripe to actually do that technology transfer over.
Yeah, and that's good. I want the 2 points, the grid and obviously the market inflection point. So I'll go to you first, Jocelyn, in terms of obviously the strain on the grid, and then there's obviously this idea that there's a sort of push from even real estate developers need and have to do this. So it's yes, there has to be cost. They have to make it economic, but at the same time, they almost need it to some degree. That they have no, I mean, they have a choice, but they kind of are being pushed by states or different rules. So when you guys approach them, what are the main kind of questions or hurdles that they still need to get over to ultimately, want to do a system? And then in terms of resiliency aspect, how much does this help the overall grid and then obviously the developer in general?
Yeah, I think for real estate developers, and this is going to be a bit different from what Zach was saying about single family homeowners, real estate developers who are doing commercial, multi-residential, industrial, or even kind of business districts or multi-use developments, yes, people care about LEED and green and sustainability, but let's be real, people don't sign on the dotted line for those things. What they really care about is what's my payback? How does this pencil economically? And do I have to do it? Because the state of Massachusetts tells me so, or the state of Colorado tells me so. So I think that ends up being the key questions that they're asking. And cost has so many manifestations, right? Cost is, well, what's the schedule? How long will it take to drill all of this? Because every month of delay is $1 million in carrying costs. Cost is also just what's my CapEx, or kind of what's the rate of capital that I would bring in to pay for this kind of energy installation. And then it's overall, like once I install it, like what are the tax incentives I can get, what are the rebates I can get, and how much will I save? So those are generally what they're asking about. The way that the question of the grid and the regulator comes in is that when you have real estate owners doing the math and saying, oh, a 5-year payback is actually pretty damn good. Like I would do a clean energy or sustainability investment if it's a 5-year payback. The IRR looks pretty good. That's when you then have utilities, an increasing number of utilities across the country saying, well, we care a lot about you being efficient because that helps us stabilize our grid. So by the way, here's $1 million for your project because it is cheaper for me as the utility to give you $1 million than to go spend $3 million doing a substation and transformer upgrade to give you the power you need. And that when that math happens, that's where the magic is flowing, because suddenly that 3-year payback or 5-year payback goes to a 3-year payback. The developer is happy and the utility is happy because they just avoided the headache of a 3-4 year transformer and substation upgrade.
Yeah. Zach, is this similar? I mean, communities are different, but in the sense of, for the discussions with the real estate developers is, give us a little bit insight on that. And then the grid, are these communities, they're efficient, they're resilient. Can they be completely isolated to themselves in terms of if the power grid goes out? Can they sort of isolate and be island mode, or do they still need the grid, like a new build out, or how does that sort of work with kind of Whisper Valley style development?
Yeah, so for Whisper specifically, I think one of the biggest benefits is that less strain that's put on the grid. We're building housing at scale, addressing another big need that the state has, and we're putting far less strain on the grid. So that's a huge benefit. I think if you introduce enough battery storage, it could be off the grid completely. That's not how we're doing it in Whisper. You have so many different parties that you have to bring into this. So there's builders, there's the developer, there's the utility, there's the city themselves. Some builders are starting to offer battery storage as an option in Whisper Valley. So you could get a ground at countertop, or you could put a battery into your mortgage, and it makes it more accessible. So there is that layer of resiliency. And when geothermal is in the picture, battery storage goes farther. It can back up more because of the efficiency that a geothermal system has. To Jocelyn's point, when you look at commercial assets or large multifamily residential assets, it's how does this affect my economics and my pro forma before I'm really interested in moving forward? And we try to boil it down to how does this impact your NOI? You're building a more efficient asset, and of course there's capital costs. You can put that in your budget, or we can come in and finance and own that on your behalf. And eventually the idea is, we show this as a big NOI improvement because there's operational savings that you're going to see because of the efficiencies. And so I think that really goes very far in overcoming those initial objections of, this costs a lot, I don't really understand it, and that, I don't like it in terms of my pro forma. You boil it down to a very simple exercise and show the benefit, and you start to get more people wanting to have further conversation. So
yeah. And then I want to talk, both of you can do this. We'll start with Zach on the state and federal input, in terms of for what Whisper and what EcoSmart's doing. How does the state and federal landscape and kind of what the policy, how can they help, these developments advance, but also what role do they play in kind of getting these things off the ground?
Yeah, I think state and local incentives go a long way. So the state of Mass is great because they have a lot of incentives that really help the economic analysis. So that's always a big deal. I think also, policymakers can drive forward adoption of these type of systems by creating creative financing solutions for developers that make sense to them. So something that EcoSmart is involved in right now is a coalition to change certain code that would make geothermal systems eligible for PIDs, MUDs, and other special district financing that a developer is very familiar with. They're using that for all of their other infrastructure, roads, lights, sewer, and now they would be able to, finance a geothermal system through that same type of financing, which increases affordability eventually to the homeowner because there's less impact on the price of the home. That starts with the legislature. They have to change certain code to make this happen. We're trying to make it happen right now, but that's a perfect example of, they get that done. There's going to be adoption driven by just this becoming more affordable and more easily understood by developers using a tool they're very familiar with.
Awesome. anything else, Jocelyn, in terms of for specifically what you're doing or anything in general, state and federal, kind of what you see could help in more advance what Bedrock is doing?
Yeah. Well, the last Geothermal House was last week in D.C. and it was amazing. And as part of that, we were speaking to a lot of members of Congress around retaining an investment tax credit paradigm. There's a couple things around this. The first is that in order to have kind of innovation investment and business model, innovation investment, you really need to have geothermal on the same playing field as what we've seen with every other energy category, renewable or not, where there are business and consumer tax credits that provide some certainty for the industry that this sector will be there and will be consistent, so that the innovation can come, drop the cost down, get the scale and whatnot. So the first thing is there's a business investment tax credit and a consumer investment tax credit that the federal government should be extending in order to help geothermal really grow and flourish as a sector. I think the other thing that is really important is that at the state level, especially for regulated utilities, less critical in Texas, that those PUCs, so these are kind of the commissions that oversee power utilities across most states, for them to go do the math on it being better for geothermal to be installed rather than spend 5 times more on adding more grid distribution and transmission, also 5 times more slowly in addition to 5 times more expensive. That kind of math happens at the state level, and is something that we would also encourage states to look at. So those are kind of 2 things I would add in addition to some of the more local and kind of bonds related ones that Zach mentioned.
Awesome. And then we'll do one more before we wrap up, and I'll go to Jocelyn first. In terms of the ownership of these assets, or kind of how the model works, I know there's different ways of doing this, and you both have touched on it, but just kind of to give a little more color on the, Bedrock comes in and does the project. Is the real estate developer then become the owner of this asset, or is it something where it's like you operate then end up selling it to them? How does your model work?
Yeah, I think there's a yes and, like the industry needs to have both, right? There's a lot of people, and I think homeowners, especially consumers, are going to be less likely to want to own this asset because the upfront cost to a homeowner, say it's $20,000, doesn't necessarily make that much sense. But you're going to live in your house, or you're going to have a 30-year mortgage, and in that case, totally EcoSmart, take on the upfront costs and I'll just pay you for this energy service or this energy lease. I think with larger commercial, multi-residential, industrial developers, the choose your own is more important. There are folks who own their assets for 30, 40 years. There are folks who lease for 15-year leases, and they're like, yeah, I have a better cost of capital than any of you because I'm, a multi-billion-dollar corporation. I want to own my systems. And then there are others who say, oh, I'm in a 7-year lease. I don't really care. But if you just install it for me and I just pay you for the energy service, I'm happier that way. So I think it's important to have both models out there.
Okay. Yeah, you kind of mentioned, Zach, but elaborate. You kind of said you guys come in and then it's just tied to the mortgage.
Yeah, I would completely agree with what you're saying about commercial assets. It's, it eventually comes down to hold period and can you capture tax credits, or would you be subject to recapture because you're going to sell the asset with what we've dealt with, and between the 5-year period, that recapture is still there. So it's either you could own it, if you're going to hold it for longer, we could come in and finance and own it. And then again, it's a pro forma exercise, and we want to make it look good on the NOI side of things. For Whisper Valley, it is, EcoSmart's going to come in and finance and own the district system. And then the homeowner puts everything, really the builder pays for everything else, so the heat pump, solar, all the on-lot piping, and then eventually, currently, everything's put into the mortgage. So the district system, and then as well everything on the lot. This legislation thing that we're working on would take the cost of the geogrid out of the homeowner's mortgage and the price of the home, and it would be, paid for through property tax assessments or things like that. So it's just a creative alternative that would eventually also, reduce the price increase of the home when it goes on the market. So it's no longer, that $20,000 more expensive than the one down the street. It's more cost comparative, but it's a better home at the end of the day. So, that's really how that
awesome.
Works.
And then wrapping it up, just quick, anything you want the audience to know that we didn't cover about heating and cooling, or just the idea of this big problem that we have to solve and things you're excited to see? Jocelyn, you can start.
I think my last comment would just be to say, you know, you can think about it like an HVAC thing, which it is, but it also is this concept that on every property out there in the country, you have this potential to make it like a free thermal energy, like resiliency hub. So this is fancy HVAC. It's also a way to just tap into geothermal at a really distributed level across developed areas. I think the story there then pulls in the opportunity to create really good jobs, like really good drilling jobs where you don't have to, I think Mary Lou from the last panel mentioned, folks are kind of like, their families are in Dallas, but they're in Midland on a 14/7 schedule, which means you literally don't see your kids for 14 days straight. If you're able to start creating jobs where you're drilling in urban areas, you could be doing that not that far from where your family is, maybe see them at night and definitely weekends. And I think that creates a whole new paradigm for what energy really means. It can be like right where you live.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that, you know, let's continue to drive creative financing solutions. That's going to drive adoption of these type of projects. I think when it really comes down to it, this technology is not that hard to work with. It's pretty simple. It just requires a certain level of education. And I mean, we have big builders in Whisper Valley who are like, man, this is pretty easy to do at the end of the day. And eventually, we can build large commercial assets, large housing projects at scale that's efficient, affordable, and just more resilient. And I think those are the real 3 key things that we should stay focused on as benefits to everybody.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jocelyn and Zach. Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.